Hello everybody and welcome back to another weekly video of the Simplified opening series. As you can see, I'm back to my standard background and setting back in the studio. And in this week's video, I would like to tell you about a line that I've known for a very long time. But since this line is in the French defense, an opening I don't play, I never really had a chance to use it, and I was never even probably intending to use it. But it was a very curious line, and I was basically waiting who will discover it from the, let's say, the top players. And then I wasn't really surprised when I discovered that recently, this year, it was actually none other than Vladimir Kramnik who discovered this line. Now, I wasn't really surprised because the line that I'm going to show you has a lot in common with the Berlin defense, as you can see in the name of this video. And then you would say, how does the French actually have anything in common with the Berlin defense? Well, in fact, it does, especially in this line, because this line is intended actually to chop off some wood and enter an endgame. Now, if this is exciting to you, as I certainly hope it is, bear with me and I will show you how to get there. Bear in mind also that this video is not a complete repertoire, so if you play the French and you already have your lines against the other possible deviations that white may have, this can be a good addition to your repertoire. And if you want to start your repertoire using this line as a basis, then you will have to create your repertoire with the deviations that white may use on the way to the line I am going to show you. So the line in question starts with the moves e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, and now the move knight f6, the so-called classical version of the French defense, as opposed to the Rubinstein variation with d takes e4 or the Winawer with bishop b4. So knight f6, and now everybody's playing e5, the old Steinitz line, which is the main line today. In the past, bishop g5 used to be the more popular move, but nowadays black is basically spoiled for choice because transposing to the Rubinstein structures with d4, knight e4 is perfectly fine for black. Now either bishop e7 or knight bd7, but bishop e7, the classical way of keeping, well, the tension in the center after e4, e5, knight fd7 is also fine for black, as is the sharper McKetchan variation with bishop b4. So here, if you are building your repertoire, you can make your choice based on your preferences. But e5 is considered critical. So knight fd7, f4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e3, and this is the base, the standard, you could say the tabia of the variation, because black has a wide choice here. So moves like a6, bishop e7, rook b8, all sorts of moves are possible. And here we start on our mission to chop some wood, and we start by taking on d4, cd4, knight d4, and now bishop c5. We are already steering the game towards an endgame. White usually plays queen d2. In case of something like bishop e2, we can do the same, chop off the wood on d4 and continue with queen b6. So because even though white may have an extra tempo in that case with bishop e2, that will not matter much in the ensuing endgame. So bishop takes d4, knight takes d4, queen d4, and queen b6. So here we are, bluntly, without any shame, exchanging pieces, chopping wood, and going for an endgame. So what to continue a little bit the history, how I got to know this line, is that I got to know it by analyzing a game by Viktor Korchnoi, a game he played against John Nunn in 1985. And in that game, Korchnoi used a very surprising to me at the time plan of attack on the king side in the endgame. And we will start this video by exploring this game, and hopefully you will understand my being impressed by Korchnoi's play and keeping this variation in mind. Again, I am a bit sorry that I never got to play it, but then again, not playing the French defense, it was a major issue when it comes to playing it. So in that game, we will start by checking the game Nan Korchnoi. John Nan took queen b6. The only alternative when white does not enter an endgame is the move queen d2, but we will leave this move for the end. The other moves that we are going to check, queen takes b6, knight b5 and long castle, all lead to the endgame. Now, before embarking on the analysis of the endgame, bear in mind that I will just give you a kind of a overview of the possible ideas that black has in the endgame. Because many move orders are possible, and it's more important to understand the ideas and the plans that black has at his disposal rather than exactly memorizing the move orders. And you will see black will have quite a big variety of ideas and setups that he can choose from. And to my surprise, the so-called standard, let's say bad French endgames do not appear to be as bad as their reputation. So let's start with the game Nan Korchnoi. Queen takes b6, knight takes b6, and now Nan played long castle. For those of you who want to check a more recent example from this position, you can check the move bishop d3, which was played recently in an online game, a game between the dynamic duo of modern chess, Hans Niemann and Vladimir Kramnik. Check the game in the database where Kramnik, one of the games where Kramnik employed this line and he got a very good position. But let's go back to the game Nan Korchnoi. Long castle, bishop d7, bishop d3, and now move h5. The move h5 is usually played to grab some space on the king side and also as a sort of a defensive measure against a possible advance by white like h4, g4, f5 and so forth. Now, it is possible to make do without the move h5, but as I said, move orders are quite flexible, and it's something that black is, if sufficiently experienced, I would say, in these positions, black can use to his own advantage. You will also see that there is a big flexibility when it comes to the positioning of the light pieces, the bishop and the knight. So in this position, the knight is already on b6, having recaptured the queen there. From b6, it can go to c4. Yeah. From c4 can go back to a5 and c6 to control the d4 square. The bishop can stay on d7, but also can go to c6. If it goes to c6, then the knight can also drop back to d7 and then go to c5. So you see, you have all these maneuvers with the light pieces, and this basically ensures that black is never without a constructive thing to do with the light pieces. And obviously, the collocation of the light pieces will depend on how white sets up his own pieces. So let's continue with knight e2. This is what Nan played. Standard maneuver, establishing a knight on the ideal blockading square on d4. King e7, knight d4, and now a move, prophylactic move by black, g6. The idea is to control the f5 square, but don't be fooled. This is only seems passive, or you could say too defensive at first sight, but bear with me, please. With this being said, f5 was possible to ignore, and for example, a move like knight c4 was already possible. Yeah, so targeting this pawn on e5 in case of f5, but also intending knight a5, knight c6 to challenge the knight on d4. So this was already an alternative to Korchnoi's move g6. g3 by white, bishop c6. So now we see one of the possible reshuffling of the pieces. Bishop comes to c6 to allow for knight d7. So rook de1 and knight d7. Yeah, the knight can go to c5, targeting the bishop on d3 and also the e4 square. c3 by white, standard play, just really normal moves, strengthening the knight, nicely positioning all the pawns on dark squares, having a good light squared bishop. But as strange as it may sound, like seems everything is great for white, but what turns out is that black's position is really extremely solid and it's very hard to break through. Even though you could say awful bishop, yes, definitely. All pawns on light squares, yes, for sure. But how do you break through? And this is the key, I would say, understanding of the position that is important for black if black wants to play this line. Yeah, to understand that even though visually this looks pretty bad from a strategic positional point of view, in practice it's very, very, very difficult to break through. Yeah. And as we will also see, it is possible for black first to take over the initiative in these positions, and second, it is possible for white to overpress and expose himself too much. Yeah. So rook a g8. This is the first move that comes like, what is this? What's the rook doing on g8? But we also already start to see the outlines of black's counterplay. He actually wants to go g5. And this is the plan that actually was so impressive to me back in the day that made me remember this line. So it seems that black is passive, just not going to do anything, but all of a sudden black's preparing a counter attack on the king side by pushing g5. However, if you're considering the counterplay with g5, I will have to warn you that this only works if black manages to open a file on the king side. What does that mean? So after g5, it's very likely that white will go f5, preventing an opening of a file on the king side. And this can only work, like I said, for black, if black can continue with g4, fixing the king side structure on h2 and g3, and then continuing with h4. So h4 intending hg3, opening the h file, intending possibly rook h3, attacking that pawn on g3, and so forth. So this is the only way for black's play with g5 to work. Now with all this keeping it in mind, now you understand that, for example, in this position white had played the prophylactic move h3. Now the plan doesn't really work. Why? Because g5, f5, g4 can be made by h4. And all of a sudden everything is dead on the king side. The rooks are not doing anything, and things are not so great for black here anymore. Because white can time whether to go f6, whether to take, whether to double on the f file first and then open the f file, depending on circumstances. This is not a good development for black. So if you're going for the plan with g5 and active play on the king side, make sure you open a file there. Korchnoi will manage to do this because Nunn did not play the move h3, after which black should actually abandon this idea of g5 and should just simply switch to more, let's say, calm play. For example, let's say knight c5, attacking that bishop, bishop c2, bishop a4, intending to exchange the bad bishop and provoking some weakness. Let's say b3, bishop d7, and now the pawn on c3 is weak. Let's say black can maybe start doubling on the c file, yeah, and targeting that pawn. Another idea is to go, let's say, after h3, a5, to stop possible ideas like b4, and then after king c2, rook c8, prepare something like knight b6, knight c4. Yeah. Okay, just patient play, but not without constructive ideas for black. However, Nunn did not play h3, he played rook f1, and now g5 works. f5, g4, we already know the drill. h4 is coming, black opens the h file and has good counterplay. Rook e2, h4, b4, threatening b5 to trap the bishop, h takes g3, now black threatens to take there and go g3, so there is no time for b5, so h takes g3, and now bishop a4, activating the bishop, yeah, and connected with ideas like rook h3, targeting the pawn on g3, it's clear that black has obtained counterplay. Also bear in mind that the knight on d7 keeps an eye on the pawn on e5, and the rook on e2 must stay on the e file to protect that pawn. So white is a bit overstretched, perhaps, having to think about all these things, the g3 pawn, the e5 pawn. King b2, rook h3, attacking the pawn on g3, rook g1, and now rook gh8. Black could have gone rook c8, targeting the pawn on c3 and preventing white's idea of king a3. In the game, Korchnoi allowed it, king a3, and what he had in mind was the move rook c8 now. But in fact, objectively speaking, this should have lost, because the piece sacrifice on a4 works for white actually if white had inserted the move f6 first and then taking the piece on a4. This is not really relevant to the opening. I'm just mentioning it for objective analysis of the game. Instead here black should have played knight b6, defending the bishop with quite unclear play. So then rook h1 can happen, exchanging one pair of rooks, exposing the pawn on g3 and so forth. But in the game, most likely in time trouble, rook c8 was played. Now white could have won by playing f6 and taking the bishop, but he played king b2 instead, defending the pawn. But now after a6, already black is better, because like I said, he's targeting the weaknesses that white has, and white is on the defensive, defending all three. I would say it was time trouble, because now Nan committed several bad moves in a row. First he played rook g2, allowing bishop d1, so the rook no longer controls the first rank, so the bishop is now active, no longer a bad French bishop. Rook e3 to e3 to control the f3 square, otherwise if rook e1, bishop f3 would have followed. Now knight b6, introducing ideas like knight f4 check and attacking the pawn on c3. Now another move, rook f2, not a very good one. Rook h1, activating the rook, take on e6, take on e6, rook f1, and now knight a4, rook king c1, rook c3, and white resigned because he's losing exchange. Take the bishop, rook f1, bishop f1, rook e3. And after rook c3, in fact, white resigned. So again, if you see this position, it's already quite an impressive turnaround. Where are the bad pieces and the bad bishop, a bad French bishop that black had? And if you look at it, white's pieces that were so great at the beginning, they stayed there for the whole game, being quite ineffective. So now you can understand probably why I was so impressed by this game, and why I remembered this variation, the game and the plan, rook ag8 and g5, g4, h4, and so forth. Now, we saw the game that sparked my, or stayed in my memory. Now let's explore some other options that white may have. I already mentioned the game Niemann-Kramnik. After queen b6, knight b6, bishop d3, bishop d7. You can check that one yourselves, because in that game Kramnik also played in quite an active manner. I want to tell you some other options that black has in this endgame, and let's check the move knight b5. This is another game by Kramnik, played against Grischuk this year over the board Blitz in Moscow. So knight b5, the idea is to, after the exchange on d4, immediately to land with a knight on d4. So king e7, h4, Grischuk starts early with h4, and now knight c5. Of course, nothing wrong with h5, but since white is somewhat lagging back in development, Kramnik sees it appropriate to start very sharp counterplay on the king side. And also this is a very good idea to keep in mind. So he goes knight c5, allowing h5, but he is quick with development with bishop d7. And after bishop d3, bear in mind the following idea, the move you already know, but not in this exact position, and that the idea is the move g5 immediately. A very fine move, and one that you should keep in mind, in these positions when the pawn is already on h5. So the idea is, it's a pawn sacrifice, but one that black will most likely regain. Now in case of hg6, hg6, black already opened the file on the king side, and let's say king d2, rook ag8, he's already again toying with the idea of g5. Obviously with active rooks, black is no worse. Grischuk took the pawn on g5, and now we see the beauty of Kramnik's idea, rook ag8, attacking the pawn, knight f3, and h6. This is just great. It's like a Benko gambit, but in the French and on the other side of the board. It's very, very funny and very, I think, visually pleasing, aesthetically pleasing. h6. Now if gh6, rook g2, so rook h2, defending the pawn, and now knight e4. Centralization and making sure that the knight is very active. So g takes h6, rook takes h6, long castle, and knight g3. And black is regaining the pawn, and we already with a better position because the pawn on e5 is weak, the pawn on g2 is weak. Kramnik unfortunately lost the game, but this has nothing to do with the opening, as already here black is better. So this is another fine idea that you should keep in mind. Now let's go back, let's check another move, long castle, which continue the chopping, take the queen, rook takes d4, king e7, h4, and now if we compare with the Kramnik line we saw, knight c5 would be a bit dubious, because after h5, bishop d7, white is better developed, especially with his rook on d4, and he can already go f5 or even b4, as when the knight is forced to go to a6. Yeah, so already things are not that great. Going to a4 would lose the bishop after exchange, and b5, and you see the rook is targeting the bishop on a4. So this is already a bit too risky, so h5 is the safe move to play with. Now bishop e2, and now we start into this slow maneuvering game. That's why I call this this video the French Berlin. The Berlin part starts now to show you when these active plans with g5 are no longer possible, how black can maneuver in this endgame. Like I said, there are many possible reshufflings of the pieces. The knight can go to c5, can go to b6, can go to b8 and c6. Yeah, the bishop can go to d7, but also, as I will also show, it can go to b6 and bishop b7. Yeah. Don't forget, the French undermining move f6 should always be kept in mind. And also there is some active play on the queen side. So let's start with the, a move like a6. The game we are following up to this point is the game between Dreyev and Bareyev, played in 1986. And I will, in that game, Bareyev played the move knight b8. But as we go along, I will propose different plans and different improvements. So one is a6. And I remember reading a very interesting note by Yakovenko, a very strong player in the teens of the and the notice of the 21st century, now no longer active. And he wrote something along the lines that if black manages to go b5, knight b6 and bishop b7, that position is already a fortress. And I was surprised to say, okay, whoa, there are still things going on the board. What do you mean fortress? But what he had in mind is that black's position is so impregnable that white cannot break through. However, with the rook already on d4, playing b5 is a bit risky because white can counter with a4 and start attacking that pawn on b5, and b4 is no longer possible thanks to that rook being on d4. So, with this in mind, black is toying with the idea of going b5, but that depends on the position of the white's rook. So rook hd1, yeah, and now b5 a4, as we said, is risky. So we don't go b5, we can go b6. Okay, and then we slowly perhaps go bishop b7 and prepare. Let's say bishop f3, bishop b7, knight e2. And now, when the knight is on e2 and the bishop is on f3, there is no pressure on the b5 pawn. We can go b5 because after a4, this pawn on b5 is no longer hanging. Yeah. And now, let's say knight c5, attacking the pawn on a4, a5, yeah, rook ac8, king b1, and appears that everything is stable and solid, yeah, but f6. Now, the French undermining move, intending to weaken this pawn on e5 if white allows the capture, yeah, or if not, after ef6, black obtains a bit more space because the pawn on e5 is no longer there. And black has already counterplay in this position. So that's one idea. Let's say a6. With keep in mind this let's say statement by Yakovenko of this fortress of pawn on b5, knight b6, bishop on b7. But always keep it in mind whether there is a rook on d4, so a4, whether there is an issue or not. Let's go back to the game. Knight b8, rook d2. Yeah, a prophylactic move, removing the rook in time, so after knight c6 it doesn't really hang. And now, curious moment, yeah? If knight c6, yeah, one of white's ideas may have been bishop b5. And you would say, okay, this makes a lot of sense, because what white wants is to obtain this standard, let's say, good knight, bad bishop French endgame. How bad that endgame actually is, let's check. Bishop d7, bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6. Not bc, because knight a4, and then the knight gets another good square in addition to d4. So better not to allow that. Let's take bishop c6, and now knight e2. And it appears that, okay, white gets this eternal knight on d4, black gets eternally bad bishop. It's the classical, schoolbook example of a bad French endgame for black. Good knight, bad bishop, and so forth. But is it really so? Let's make a few more moves. f6, knight d4, f takes e5, f takes e5, rook a, f8. And now all of a sudden, with ideas like rook f4, targeting that pawn on h4, doubling on the f file, going rook e4, targeting the pawn on e5, it transpires that thanks to the active rooks, black actually keeps equilibrium fairly easily in this seemingly bad French endgame. So the active rooks compensate for white's superior light piece. So even here, allowing this, at first sight, awful French endgame, thanks to the open f file and the active rooks, black is fine. In the game though, black decided not to allow this, and he went for bishop d7 first. And now white played another prophylactic move, rook hd1, doubling on the d file, and the idea is if knight c6, the knight no longer defends the bishop, so white can play knight e4. And this is the idea of the doubling of the rooks. If d4, rook d7. Yeah. So black could have changed the plan and could have gone bishop c6 and knight d7. Nothing wrong with that, and the shuffling goes on. Yeah, the knight from d7 can go to c5, can go to b6. We have already seen this collocation of the light pieces. But he went g6. Okay, possible. Yeah, and white goes b3. Now, since it's difficult to make progress on the king side, because g4, h4 just weakens the h4 pawn and opens the h file, which only black can use, the only way for white to make progress is to start advancing on the queen side. So he wants to go king b2, a4, and start to push there. But we will see that black has actually quite good ways to deal with those advances as well. So a6, still not knight c6, knight e4, a4, yeah, and now finally bishop c6. Black could have insisted on putting a knight on c6 by playing, let's say, rook d8. Yeah, and if bishop king b2, knight c6. Yeah, he could have insisted on that, and the knight is controlling the a5 and b4 squares, yeah, making it a bit more difficult for white to advance. But he went bishop c6, king b2, knight d7, a5, yeah, and now black decided it's time to counter on the queen side, but it's possible to do so in more than one way. For example, rook ac8 looks like a standard move, but in fact has the idea of doubling on the c file, let's say rook c7 and rook hc8, which would expose a little bit the knight on c3, and the idea is that if the knight moves from c3, then bishop b5 exchanges the bad bishop. Yeah, so this is one constructive idea that black has in the position. But black played rook hb8, and the idea is obviously to go b6 or b5 and get rid of this knight on pawn on b5, on a5, sorry, or in case of b5, b4 to gain some space on the queen side. So rook d4 by white, and now already black could have gone for b6. Yeah. And if rook a1, white wants to put pressure on the pawn on a6. Yeah. Now knight c5 is possible, but it's also possible to sacrifice a pawn with a move like rook b7, and then if a b6, a5, and the knight is taking on b6, and already black has already good position. This reminds me of some Sicilian positions where black is playing on the queen side with the knight on b6, semi-open b file from b6, a4 ideas may be possible, knight c4 ideas may be possible, and it's a good position for black. So this was already possible for black. He played knight c5, and after rook b4, he could have gone back and go knight d7 and b6, but he preferred to go b5 and shut the position on the queen side. Perfectly fine, it's possible, but less dynamic. Again, the idea is if a b6, a5, and if when the rook moves, rook takes rook bd4, rook takes b6, and again black is quite active on the queen side. In fact, black is already better here. And this is, for example, one line where white overextends, pushes too hard, and all of a sudden black is better because white overextended his position, and black now took over the initiative on the queen side. So in the game, after b5, white went back rook bd4, and now black decided to just keep tight and played rook a7. It was possible to be active, and I will show you this line because I think it's quite an instructive one. b4, knight a2, bishop b5. So positionally works perfectly for black because he gets to exchange the bad French bishop, but in return, well, he's giving up a pawn. However, let's check the line. Bishop takes b5, rook takes b5, knight takes b4. Black cannot take on a5 because this knight c6 check is quite annoying. So king e8, avoiding the check, and rook a1. Rook a b8, attacking the knight, and now we see the idea. Black is a pawn down, but the extra pawn that white has is on the queen side, and black is very active on the queen side, so it's not easily visible how white can actually advance there and try to convert that extra pawn. And if, for example, the knight is hanging now, and if the knight goes to c6, then black will simply move the rook b7, and the knight is not so stable on c6 because the king d7 will attack it. And if the knight goes back to d3, knight d3, knight takes d3, rook takes d3, and now rook b4, attacking the pawn on f4, g3, rook e4, and black's active rooks again easily hold the balance in spite of being a pawn down. The rook can come to b5, targeting the pawn on a5, which means that white will have to keep the pawn on the rook on the a file, defending the pawn on a5, and then with all the active rooks, how is black's active rooks, how is white supposed to convert the extra pawn? It shouldn't really be able to. So this is another line where black with active play can achieve enough counterplay. So in the game, black played rook a7, knight a2, rook c7, knight b4, and bishop b7. So again, bunker style, perfectly fine. Even though later on black lost the game, he was actually equal until the very end. And this is just an example that black can play in different styles in this endgame. He can seek for active plans, but if he doesn't want to, he can also play bunker style, be very, very passive, and rely on the impregnability of the position, as we can see. If you look at this position, white is really dominating. Great knight on b4, blockade on the dark squares, bad bishop, but how does white break through? Yeah. You can check the game Dreev-Barré from 1986 to see how this continued. Like I said, black was equal until the very end. He made a mistake in time trouble. He should not have lost, but he did. So this is the again showing you the different ways that black can treat this endgame. Now we will go back and check the move that avoids the endgame. I hope that by now you had some better understanding, got a bit of the flair of the possible active plans that black has in the endgame, and hopefully you don't find it boring or prospectless or simply a bad French endgame as it used to be considered. I think now that Kramnik has played it a couple of times, people will start to notice this line, and I think some other people will also start using it. Now we go back to move 12 and we check the only move that is not an endgame, and that is the move queen d2, avoiding the exchange of queens. And now black has a choice. Does he want to punish white for avoiding the endgame and goes pawn grabbing, which leads to very sharp play, or he can continue in a very simple style similar to the rhythm of the endgame that we just explored and obtain a very solid position. I will show you both options. So queen b2 is obviously the more testing move, grabbing a pawn, rook b1, queen a3, knight b5, attacking the queen, yeah, and threatening knight c7 or knight d6. So queen takes a2, attacking the rook, knight d6 check, king e7, and now rook c1 is the best move for white. Queen b4 may look tempting, but after a5, white has nothing better than a perpetual check. Knight f5, king d8, queen e7, king c7, queen d6, king d8 with a perpetual. So, therefore, after king e7, white should play rook c1, and now b6, allowing for the queen to go back to a5. Bishop e2, queen a5, seeking exchange. White must not allow that, he's 2 pawns down. c3, and now best would have been for black an improvement over the game Carlsen Sosa played at the Torino Olympiad 2006. f6, short castle, queen c5 check, king h1, rook f8, and now g5 comes next with a total mess on the board. So the idea is to undermine white's center, and with it the knight on d6. But obviously this is extremely sharp. Black has a king in the center, but also 2 pawns up. In some ways this position reminds me of the poison pawn variation in the Najdorf. So this is the sharper version. Yeah, if you feel like it, you can explore this, and you can play it. It's perfectly playable for black. But if you're more, let's say, positionally oriented, knight c5 is the way to go. Long castle, bishop d7. And what happens is that simply black castles long, and we have a similar position to the endgame, only that the queens are on board, but black's queen is quite good on b6, whereas white's queen on d2 doesn't really have many active possibilities. So with this in mind, Kasparov played queen d4 in this position. The game we're following is the game Kasparov-Timan from Horgen 1995. So a6 by Timan, h4, long castle, rook h3. So this is Kasparov's idea, not so much to advance with h5 and so forth, but to activate the rook along the third rank. So bishop c6, we already know the setup, yeah, the bishop going to c6 to allow for some knight d7 ideas. Knight d2 was played by Kasparov, opening the third rank, and now an improvement over Timan's play is the move king c7, defending the queen on b6, and the idea being that after rook c3, knight d4 is possible. So no need to put the knight on d7 when it can go to d4 on a more active spot, since white's knight no longer controls the e4 square. So knight d4, and after the exchange of queens, black has already a great version of the endgame with that knight already being on e4. And if white does not play rook c3, let's say white plays something like h5, yeah, then black can start playing on the king side in a way we already know. g6, try intending hg, opening the h file, and in case of h6, now rook hg8, and then g5 is coming. And even in the middle game, black obtains counterplay in a similar way as we saw in the endgame. So that's pretty much about it, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you found this French Berlin, as I named it, quite an interesting line, as honestly I did. If you play the French, I think this can be a good addition to your repertoire. If you don't play the French but you like the line, you may want to start learning the French and comprising your repertoire based on this line, because this is the main line that white plays against the knight c3, knight f6 variation. So we are quite likely to meet this line in practice. So, well, you still need to do some work with the other lines, the Tarash with knight 2, the advance, and so forth. But if you like this, I think it's a good basis for, let's say, positionally oriented French repertoire. So, what remains now is to thank you for watching. Now comes my cowboy Hikaru moment. Make sure you smash that subscribe button and let me know what you think about this in the comments. Feedback is always welcome, and you know that I always reply. So thanks for watching. Wish you all the best and see you soon, pretty soon. Bye.